Good day, this is Jim Pytel from Columbia Gorge Community College, Renewable Energy Technology Program, and this is RT 120 Hydraulics. Today we're going to continue our discussion about pressure control valves, and we're going to discuss the sequence valve in detail. But before we actually hit the sequence valve, let's just revisit the pressure relief valve, which is quite obviously right there. How do I know that that's a pressure relief valve? Well, it's normally closed. It's between the pump and the tank, so located next to the pump. Where is it sensing pressure? On its inlet. And when it exceeds a certain pressure set on our biasing spring, what's it do? It opens. And what else can we say? Well, it's probably pilot acted. Technically, I should draw that inside the schematic, but we're just going to assume it's a pilot acting. But the key thing to remember is it's next to the pump. Anytime you see a valve next to a pump, it's probably a pressure relief valve, okay? One last thing too, it's internally drained. We're assuming it's internally drained because again, our outlet port is extremely low pressure. Okay, now I've got a system here and notice the conspicuous hole right here. Just leave that hole as is right now. What is it? Well, it looks like it's two cylinders of varying sizes in a parallel relationship, okay? Just ignore that hole for a second. And what we know from parallel cylinders, the cylinder with the lowest pressure requirement will extend first. But as the name implies, sequence valve, basically what we want to do is ensure operations follow a specific sequence. You know, since we're talking about pressure control valves, it sounds like a sequence valve does something when pressure reaches a certain value. Okay? So, what if I put a pressure relief valve in here? It's not a pressure relief valve anymore. That's what's known as a sequence valve. And I'm not done with the schematic just yet. I'm not done with the schematic. So, this is a sequence valve. It's normally closed. When pressure reaches a certain point, it will open. Where is it? Well, it's next to an actuator. And that's a generalization. Next to an actuator. It's within the circuit, basically, what I'm saying. Where is it sensing pressure? On its inlet. Pressure has to rise to a certain value on its inlet port before that thing opens. And now, here comes where I finish the schematic. Is it internally or externally drained? The answer is externally. Why? So here's a dot, 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 dot. Well, quick answer is that outlet port is pressurized. Okay, so you have to externally drain a sequence valve. All sequence valves are externally drained. Okay, and the reason why is again because that outlet port is pressurized. And just do a quick diagram here. Here's our pilot. Here's our main spool that's plugging that hole between P and T, and depends upon this little passageway in here, and this is where we set it. If it was internally drained, that would be a problem because this T-port is no longer a T-port. It's a pressurized outlet port, and we could inadvertently pressurize back here. So we do not want to do that. We want to go ahead and externally drain that. So how we do that, oops, is we make sure that is externally drained, indicated obviously with that portion on the schematic. Okay, so what else can I say about a sequence valve before we actually go into its operation is you are typically going to see them with a check valve bypass. Okay, externally drained. I should finish my writing. Okay, so that's a sequence valve. Here's our pressure relief valve. Okay, just like a pressure relief valve, it requires a certain, well, it's closed until a certain pressure on the inlet exceeds a certain value, and then it will open. The only difference is it's externally drained, and there's a check valve bypass. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up here. And what we have here, this circuit here, is the clamp and bend circuit. The clamp and bend circuit is probably used in every hydraulics course you've ever seen on Earth. The clamp and bend to illustrate the sequence valve. The reason why everybody uses this to demonstrate it is because this is how it's really used, and it's an excellent way of demonstrating the purpose of a sequence valve. Notice it's a clamp and bend, not a bend and clamp, not a clamp bend. Basically, what it's saying is I want to clamp an object before I bend it. Okay, so the sequence valve is exactly what you use for it. Here is our clamp circuit, and here's our big old bender. Okay, we want to make sure that our workpiece is clamped before it's bent. Okay, so our piece of sheet metal or whatever you want to bend slid into place. We go ahead and activate our directional control valve to our straight through position. Again, pressurized flow goes this way, and it starts filling up our clamp circuit, and our clamp circuit clamps our workpiece. What's happening here? There is no flow because the sequence valve is normally closed until it reaches a value specified by our variable adjustment. So let's say it requires 500 psi to properly clamp this thing. Well, at 500 psi, that workpiece is properly clamped. This valve opens up and allows pressurized flow to enter, and then the bend cylinder extends. So clamp, then bend. So sequence valve is doing exactly its job. It's ensuring an orderly sequence of operations. Now, the immediate question is, what the heck is a check valve doing in their bypass? Well, check valve bypass is for when you want to retract the bend, and for that matter, the clamp, you just go ahead and put this in the cross-through position. It basically acts as if the sequence valve wasn't there. Basically, you simultaneously retract the clamp and bend cylinders, okay? So all the check valve bypass does is basically ensures reverse operation, correct reverse operation, okay? So now the immediate question for you is, well, hey, I want to make a super clamp and bender, and I want to clamp and then bend, but when I retract it, I want to retract my bend first and then retract my clamp. You know, basically you are clamping, then bending, retracting the bend, then retracting the clamp. So let's go ahead and modify our existing circuit to see if we can make something like that. And by all means, pause the tape and try to do that yourself. And this is how I would do it right here. I would put another sequence valve on the rod end of the clamp. And let's go ahead and illustrate how this works here. Basically, it's going to go exactly the same as before, you know, basically pressurized flow from the straight through position. It's going to try to enter this guy's cap end. There's no restriction there, but there is a restriction here. The cap end will extend on the clamp until it receives a pressure signal on the sequence valve of 500 psi, and then the bend will extend. What's happening at the outlet of the rod end of the clamp? Well, it's going through this check valve bypass. Pretty cool, huh? So it's not interfering with the clamp then bend. Okay, now we want to go ahead and retract our bender, then retract our clamper. Pressurized flow in the cross-through position basically goes through here. It can't because there's a sequence valve. Enters the rod end of our bender. Return flow goes through the check valve, no problem, until our clamp is bottomed out and pressure continues to rise and rise and rise until the requirements set by this biasing spring here allows our sequence valve to open, and then our bender retracts. Pretty cool, huh? So that is the sequence valve. These are direct acting sequence valves because it is taking a sensing its pressure at its own inlet. There is something else called a remote pressure sensing sequence valve, which I'm going to draw here in a second. And basically all it's doing is taking a pressure signal from somewhere else in the system rather than its inlet. Okay, so here's an example of a remotely controlled sequence valve as contrasted to a direct activated. Okay, where is the remotely controlled sequence valve? Well, and first off, I have not drawn the pilot line just yet. So pretty obviously it's right there. What's this guy? That's still our pressure relief valve. Okay, so a remotely operated sequence valve. Again, it's taking pressure from somewhere else. I have not drawn the pilot line just yet. The reason why is, let's pretend this is a crane system and it's got stabilizers on the side and you've got your boom. It's probably a good idea to make sure the stabilizers are down and have achieved a certain pressure rating before you actually extend the boom. Okay, so this could be some form of safety sequencing. Okay, notice I've got two directional control valves, controlling two independent portions of a circuit. However, I want to make sure one of them is activated before I do the other. That's how you do a remotely controlled sequence valve. So we want to make sure the pressure on our stabilizer when it goes down and hits the earth has achieved a certain pressure. So what we do is we would take our pilot line and sense pressure from right there. Pretty cool, huh? So now what happens is, let's say you jump inside the cab of the crane and you're like, booms away, and start fiddling with this. The pump is running. Nothing's going to happen because pressurized flow is going to enter here and it's going to stop because pressure in the stabilizer has not, pressure at the cap end of the stabilizer has not achieved a certain pressure rating requirement. Let's say, again, 500 psi. It requires 500, at least 500 psi to go ahead and get a safe grab on the ground. Okay, so now after you've fiddled around with the boom, you're like, okay, may as well go ahead and listen to the operating instructions of these things and activate the directional control valve of my stabilizers and straight through position. Pressurized flow enters the cap end of my stabilizers. It goes down, crushes the asphalt until a pressure rating of 500 psi is reached. And now, when you go ahead and activate the boom, the sequence valve is open, pressurized flow enters. Well, we should actually have done it in a cross-connect position here because we want to raise our boom. We can actually extend our boom. Okay, what's missing on my sequence valve? It's externally drained. Okay, so that is the remote controlled sequence valve as contrasted to the direct activated sequence valve. Again, let's go over the basics of a sequence valve. Normally closed, senses pressure from its inlet, or in the case of a remote, somewhere else within the system. It's externally drained, typically check valve bypass. Okay, so where is it located? It's within the circuit, next to an actuator. Okay, close cousin of the pressure relief valve. So again, pressure relief valve does pretty much the same thing. The only thing is pressure relief valves are typically internally drained. Typically, they do not have a check valve bypass. Okay, that's pretty much it for the sequence valve. Again, what is its main function in life? As the name implies, it ensures operations follow a specific sequence. Since we're talking about pressure control, it's probably making its decision based off of pressure.